Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on a really forgotten piece of American history. It's the story of some truly radical unions that were fighting for women's rights way, way before it was mainstream, and how Cold War politics brought the whole thing crashing down. So think about this for a second. Equal pay, paid maternity leave, even employer-funded childcare. These all sound like pretty modern demands, right? Things we're still talking about today. Well, what if I told you this was the core platform for some incredibly radical unions almost 100 years ago? All right, so let's start at the very beginning, with the rise of these pioneering groups. We're going to look at the truly groundbreaking policies they were fighting for. Policies that were just decades, and I mean decades, ahead of their time. You have to appreciate the timing here. It's 1929. The Great Depression is literally just beginning. And the Trade Union Unity League, a group with ties to the Communist Party, is demanding all of this. This wasn't just some list of nice-to-have ideas. This was a completely radical vision for what the American workplace should look like. Now, one of the most effective champions for this vision was the United Electrical Workers Union. You'll see them called the UE. And get this, they took the idea of equal pay a huge step further. They argued not just for equal pay for the same job, but for jobs of comparable worth. So think of it this way. Why should a job mostly done by women, one that requires a ton of dexterity, be paid less than a janitorial job mostly done by men? The UE was challenging the entire system of how women's work was valued. And for the time, that was just a revolutionary concept. And their commitment wasn't just about policies, it was about power. They were actually putting women in charge. These communist-led unions actively promoted women into the highest levels of leadership. You have Eleanor Nelson becoming the first woman on the executive board of the CIO, that's the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and Robbie May Riddick, who became the first black woman on a CIO International Executive Board. They weren't just talking the talk, they were absolutely walking the walk. Okay, but here's where things get complicated. Not all unions were on board with this vision, not by a long shot. In fact, this whole issue created a really deep divide inside the American labor movement itself, especially when it came to women's rights. And you don't just have to take my word for it. The numbers tell the story pretty clearly. Just look at this. Contracts from the communist-led unions were more than twice as likely to have an equal pay for equal work clause than the contracts from their anti-communist rivals. It's not even close. This shows a clear, measurable difference in what they were prioritizing. And this difference had huge real-world consequences for workers. On one hand, you had the UE, which successfully fought against things like separate seniority lists that always penalized women. But on the other hand, you had a mainstream union like the UAW, which often ended up writing gender inequality right into their contracts, basically cementing a separate and unequal status for their female members. All right, now we get to a really fascinating and kind of confusing twist in this whole story. The debate over the Equal Rights Amendment. It created this major rift, and the reasons why are probably not what you'd expect. So first things first, let's be clear on what the ERA actually was. It's a proposed amendment to the Constitution, and its goal is to guarantee equal legal rights for all citizens, no matter their sex. Now, on the surface, that sounds like something these progressive unions would have been all over, right? I know what you're thinking. It seems totally counterintuitive, doesn't it? Why on earth would these dedicated champions of women's rights actively fight against a constitutional amendment that's all about promoting legal equality? Well, the answer comes down to what they were afraid they would lose. They saw the ERA as this big legal sledgehammer that could accidentally smash all the specific hard-won laws that were already on the books protecting women, especially women who weren't in unions, from things like dangerously long hours and unsafe working conditions. So, in their eyes, it was a terrible trade-off, giving up concrete, real-world protections for a more abstract principle. And this brings us to the fall, because this progressive vision and the unions that championed it were about to face a powerful two-pronged attack during the Cold War, an attack that would ultimately destroy them and everything they were fighting for. The first hit came from the government. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 was basically a precision weapon. It forced every union leader to sign an affidavit swearing they weren't a communist. And if they refused, well, their union was basically vaporized. They were barred from elections, couldn't be certified the bargain for workers, and they lost all legal protection from employers who wanted to bust up their union. It was a killer blow. But the second blow, that one came from inside the labor movement itself. As anti-communist hysteria swept the country, mainstream labor leaders turned on their more radical brothers and sisters. You can see it right here in this quote from the head of the CIO, Philip Murray, calling the UE, one of the most progressive unions in the country, a front for the Communist Party. This set the stage for a massive internal purge. And just look at the sheer scale of the damage. The CIO ended up expelling 11 of its own unions, wiping out organizations that represented over 1 million workers. 1 million. Just gone. In one fell swoop, the most progressive wing of the entire American labor movement was decapitated. So what's the big takeaway here? What was really lost when these unions were destroyed? Well, this wasn't just some political victory for anti-communists. It was a huge, profound setback for social progress in America. A whole generation of advocacy for these incredible ideas, equal pay, paid leave, childcare, was just silenced. These concepts got driven out of the mainstream conversation, they were labeled as subversive, and they wouldn't really reemerge with any serious force for decades. It's like a vital chapter of labor history was just ripped out of the book and thrown away. And that's really the question I want to leave you with. What's the real cost when we let politics get in the way of social progress? What happens when ideas are judged not on their merit but on their political labels? And you have to wonder, what other hidden histories of progress are still out there, just waiting to be uncovered?